Hello, this is Justin Williams with the Wolfpacker Podcast. I'm joined today, as always, by co-host Matt Carter, and we're also joined by a very special guest today. We've got longtime North Carolina sports writer, very knowledgeable source on NC State football recruiting in the home state of North Carolina. I believe, and I'm a young guy, so correct me if I'm wrong here, Sammy, but I believe he's nicknamed the King, Sammy Batten, longtime Fayetteville Observer sports writer. And before we get too far into this episode, this podcast is brought to you in part by JFQ Lending. With interest rates below 3%, there has never been a better time to lock in a low fixed interest rate on your mortgage. You'll never need to think about refinancing again. Set it and forget it. And with JFQ Lending, you are guaranteed to get the highest level of customer service. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and over 3,000 5-star reviews. Give Hunter Clausen a call today at 480-513-3992 or email Hunter directly at hclausen@jfqlending.com. That's HCLAUSSEN@jfqlending.com. JFQ Lending, Inc., Equal Access Lender, licensed in over 40 states, www.jfqlending.com. And while you're at it, head over to thewolfpacker.com and use promo code PACK60. That's promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis. If you're listening to this episode, you're obviously interested in NC State football recruiting, so we've got plenty of great stuff over there at thewolfpacker.com. Use that promo code PACK60 to unlock all of the great premium content on Wolfpack football recruiting and everything else Wolfpack athletics. So head over to thewolfpacker.com right now and use that promo code PACK60. And remember to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and give this video a thumbs up. Okay, so Sammy, thank you for your patience in that extended intro there.
Matt, you were right. He was very professional with that intro.
I'm telling you, I couldn't pull it off. That's why we have Justin take over the show now.
Well, I'm glad I can be of use in somehow, some way. But Sammy, where I want to start is, first of all, where I've heard this nickname, the King. Now, where does that come from? What is the origin story of the King? Because that's quite a nickname.
Yeah, well, I can't go into the real reasons and origins of it on public forums like this. I would just say that it came from college, and some of my fraternity brothers and friends in college gave me that nickname, and many of them still refer to me as King. I'll just leave it at that without implicating myself in any ne'er-do-well themes. Yes.
The mystery makes it even better. I'll have to hear the full story after we get done recording this podcast. But Matt, where do you guys know each other from? Because obviously covering the NC State beat long time, you guys seem well acquainted. So what's your history together? And Matt, if you want to kick us off with a question for Sammy.
Well, I mean, Sammy, I've been reading Sammy, not to make him feel old. Forever. Yeah, back in and this is a good place to start before we kind of get into NC State football recruiting class. Before people like me jumped onto the internet, if you wanted football recruiting, you either went to Sammy Batten at the Fayetteville Observer or Bill Cole at the Winston-Salem Journal. Those two guys had you covered. Now, I grew up in Winston-Salem, so I started getting hooked on football recruiting, reading Bill Cole and the sports pages, and then I started hearing Sammy Batten on radio shows and Super Prep magazine that he helped out on. So, and then of course we met covering NC State football and NC State basketball, and Sammy's a great guy. I regret that he's a St. Louis Cardinals fan, but nobody is perfect in life.
Yeah, nobody's perfect.
Let me ask Sammy this, because you can kind of, I was telling Justin earlier about how big signing day at one point was in February on the internet. It would crash the internet. What was it like to cover football recruiting before the internet, when it kind of just you and maybe Bill Cole chasing down all of these prospects and all these leads, and trying to get the information. What was that like?
Well, Matt, when I started out, just started out kind of basically writing for our paper. But then Eddie Landreth, God rest him, had been doing the state rankings for Super Prep, and Alan Wallace, who is kind of one of the godfathers in this field nationally. Eddie got so much more freelance work that he couldn't do the rankings anymore. And so he asked me to do it. So I kind of got that national exposure by working with Super Prep, which at the time was just a twice a year, basically magazine. And that's how football recruiting was covered back then, other than, once in a while in a daily newspaper article. But in general, Super Prep was the only thing out there. And then that kind of went into, you would have these 800 numbers you could call for updates on recruits. And then all that morphed into the web, which I still believe football recruiting is the thing that started, this great explosion on the web in terms of sports, because everybody knows who the top 100 basketball players are in the country, but there's so many more football players, and the eagerness to find out about those guys from the fans just drove the popularity of the school websites, and for the networks like Rivals and 24/7 and those things. So like I said, when I started, it was just a daily newspaper article here and there, a Super Prep magazine twice a year, and maybe you could call an 800 number maybe twice a week and get an update from somebody like Alan Wallace on a national type recruit. But now it's gone, to where you guys report on every movement, by a potential NC State recruit, and the same thing for other school websites. And again, I do think, and you guys can tell me, how much more interest do you get out of your football recruiting news as opposed to the other stuff on your site? I got a feeling that's probably one of the driving factors for you.
It did, especially from a premium standpoint, that inside information, and that everybody wants to know who's coming, when, who's committing, and it's always, I think it's like in baseball, it's everybody wants their minor league prospect list, right?
Yeah.
Or the NFL draft, and it's always the hope for tomorrow that recruiting provides, and you can manage to convince yourself that the lowly two-star is going to be the next Bo Jackson or Tom Brady or something like that.
I think it's definitely, it's definitely harder, to predict a successful high school player going into college football than basketball. Like I said, these top 100 basketball guys, they're going to come in, they're going to play, and they're probably going to be gone after 1 or 2 years. Right. But for football, it's a whole different animal. And because there's so many more of them and so many more players to kind of write about and predict about, again, I think that's what is so interesting about college football recruiting and why I enjoy it so much.
Sammy, what do you make of the Twitter era of football recruiting? Because as a young sports writer myself, I can't really imagine a world in football recruiting where Twitter isn't the ultimate medium of where all this information starts and all these rumors kind of go amongst the internet. What would you say is the biggest difference between, pre-Twitter football recruiting and now what football recruiting has come in 2020, 2021, where so much of it is driven on Twitter and social media?
Well, so much fewer stories about who people are committing to are getting broken by us writers now, because the kids are breaking the news themselves on Twitter. I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but I'd be willing to bet 60 or 70% of the kids are announcing their decision on Twitter or other social media platforms now, as opposed to 10 years ago, where Matt might be breaking every story about an NC State recruit and where, when he's going to commit. But now it's, you see it every day. I mean, a kid, not only does he announce his commitment on Twitter, but, 2 months ago he announced his top 10, or his top 5, So the athletes themselves are kind of taking a little bit more control, of their destiny, so to speak, because of Twitter. And I think it's okay. It does kind of take away a little bit of the suspense, I think, when when reporters are kind of fighting to find out, where a kid's going. But I think it's cool too for the kids because, that gives them some power about when and where they can release the news that is their personal news after all.
Yeah. Sammy, you've been doing this a long time. I've been doing it less time than you, but also a long time. I'm not sure I remember an in-state recruiting class. I will take it further. I don't think there's ever in my time been an in-state recruiting class like this one, this deep, this loaded. What stood out to you before we kind of jump into some of these guys that have already signed? Many of them have already enrolled. What stood out to you about the depth of this in-state class in 2021?
Yeah, I think, Matt, just before, I got on with you guys, I started going through and trying to count how many kids have signed with FBS programs in the state with this 2021 class. And I think I counted 88 right now. Now, there could very well be some more, as we know, by tomorrow or in the next month. I mean, some late additions to classes always happen, following the signing period. But yeah, the depth of this class, I mean, the defensive line, receivers. I mean, the receivers in this, pretty incredible bunch of receivers in this class. Then you have, quarterbacks like Drake May, which again, North Carolina's never been really known for producing quarterbacks, but here's a guy who, first committed to Alabama before Mac Brown was able to draw him back in and keep him at home. But I just, up and down the line. I mean, and again, you can go down to the number 60 or 70 player in this state too, and still find, great quality. And I don't know. We've had years, I think 2 years ago, maybe we had over 100 players signed with FBS programs. So, and I think that was the highest ever that I've been able to count. But before it's over with, I think this class could well go over 100. And again, just the depth of it, at certain positions, like I said, receivers are huge, a bunch of great receivers in this class. Michael Crowwell is one of them, Julian Gray, Gavin Blackwell, who's going to UNC. Just, you can go down the line. This time after time, just really great receiver prospects, in this state this year. And that's kind of what impressed me about it. That and the high number of FBS signees already as we head into the second signing period.
One thing that kind of stood out to me is I kind of told people, I know there was some frustration with the success that, at least among NC State fans, I should say, with the success that Mac Brown and the guys in Chapel Hill were having, because they got their fair share of the top 10, 20 players in the state. And I would point out, I told a lot of people, look, in a normal year, Travali Price would have been a top 10 player in the state of North Carolina, or Jordan Poole would have been pushing, potentially top 10 player in the state of North Carolina. It just so happened it was such a deep year, but don't get too caught up on top 10 this year. Maybe look more at top 25, top 30 this year.
Yeah, I'm telling you, top 50. I'm telling you, there's some really, great players down through that whole class. You look at a guy like Jaleel Davis, a wide receiver, wound up going to Virginia, but, he's, again, a guy that's down at the end of this, or Josiah Davis, I'm sorry. But Jaleel Davis is an offensive lineman for Richmond, who, again, maybe in that 30 to 40 range ranking, but again, has got great potential. I saw him several times. You're talking about a guy who's 300 pounds, but doesn't look it at all, and is very mobile. And again, just a guy who is equally good pass blocking as well as run blocking. Played for Brian Till down there at Richmond, and I think is going to be a great addition at NC State. But again, these are guys who kind of rated down, not in the top 10, not in the top 10, 20, but can be great college players before it's over. And that's what I'm saying. And you were saying about this class is the depth in it is really incredible.
Yeah, one of the ways we've kind of characterized this class, and I think it's a fair conclusion that Matt has kind of reached. He's wrote about it in a couple past columns this year about how this class is just a smart class by the NC State coaching staff. In a year where, your rival, your crosstown rival, is having so much success, at an ACC level, at a national level, not just at the state level. You got to go out there and you got to find the guys that are going to be program fits, that are going to be guys that you can develop into strong ACC caliber talent in a matter of a couple years, 3 years, etc. Do you think that's a fair characterization of this 2021 class for NC State? Would you call it a smart class, Sammy?
Yeah, I'd call it a smart class for a lot of different reasons. One, if you look at it across the board, they signed somebody at almost every position. They met their needs. Obviously there was a big need to bring in a premier quarterback prospect. They did that with Eric McLaughlin. And again, you talk about rankings, and again, maybe this wasn't a top 20 class, but it's in the top 30 in almost every ranking you see. So that, when you're talking about 120, how many FBS teams are, that's pretty good. And again, I think they met the kind of needs that they had in addition to getting players at every position. So they helped their depth by getting people at every position. They helped their talent by bringing in players at positions where they needed, some help. And again, I think this is a real smart class. In a year where maybe North Carolina does get all the attention, this class could end up being better, before it's all said and done.
Well, Matt was talking so much about those rankings that you have for NC State. I don't know if it was NC State specifically or the state of North Carolina, maybe both.
State of North Carolina.
Okay. Well, with that in mind, when you're looking at this signee list for 2021 for the Wolfpack, give us a couple guys that maybe jump off the page to you that NC State fans should be particularly excited about. Maybe one on the offensive side of the ball, one on the defensive side of the ball.
Well, the guy easy is on the offensive side. Micah Crowwell comes from a football family. His dad, his brothers have played in Virginia. His uncles have played in the NFL. And what's interesting about him to me is obviously he was injured his senior year, didn't get a chance to play in his junior year of high school. I guess this would have been his senior year.
Right.
But so he's a guy who's coming back off an injury. But if you watched him in his sophomore film, just an incredible playmaker. He's a very physical type receiver. He kind of reminds me, or not reminds me of Jalen Samuels, but can do a lot of things like Jalen did when he was at NC State. They used to call Jalen the Swiss Army knife. Well, I think, Micah Crowwell could be a similar type player. I think he could be used in a lot of different ways, catching the ball, running with it, just doing a lot of different things. He's that kind of athlete. And I think he's going to have, he's had a lot of time now to kind of recoup from the injury that knocked him out, basically a whole year. And I think he's going to be a really exciting, player on the offensive side of the ball eventually for NC State. And we know, obviously, NC State can use some receiver help. And if he's healthy, I think he's a guy that can come in and do that. I really have to say something about Julian Gray, also on the offensive side. Well, again, Julian wasn't maybe the highest ranked player in the state. This kid can run. He's that guy that you can throw the deep ball to, throw it up in the air, and can run under it and make the great catch. And I was really impressed a lot with him, playing out of Huff High School, just because of his speed. He's got track type speed, and I think that's something in many years that NC State has kind of lacked on the outside. Defensively, the two guys that I really love in state, I had them ranked in my top 20, Travali Price and Zion Reeves, again, because there were so many really good defensive linemen at the top of the rankings. These guys kind of got overlooked a little bit. Price is just one of these just really powerful bull type rushers coming off the edge. I do think eventually, when he grows a little bit and gains a little weight, he could become an interior defensive lineman at some point in his career. But just when it comes to just coming out of his stance and going after the quarterback, he was really as good as there was in the state this year. And then Zion Reeves, another guy, you were talking about imposing physically. Here's a kid that's 6'7", 6'8", maybe now, 260 pounds, just physically quicker than you would imagine a guy his size being. And, he's going to wreak a lot of havoc coming in off the edge, if nothing else, just because of his height and his ability to block passing lanes when he's rushing the passer. All he's got to do is hold his arms up, and he covers up, can cover up a lot of the passing lanes that opposing quarterbacks are looking at. So those are two guys I think defensively are going to wind up being part of that NC State tradition that they've established of developing great defensive linemen.
Matt, not to hog Sammy too much here, but I do want to ask him a specific question about Zion Reeves, because he's got that basketball background about him. When you first meet him, you think you're meeting a basketball player who could, be an outstanding center at any high school in the state of North Carolina. But, based on your experience of covering the recruiting scene specifically for football, I'm sure you've had your fair share of encounters with athletes that are two-sport athletes that play football and basketball. How does that typically translate to the football field? Once they get to the college level, in your experience from what you've seen, do you think they're able to kind of bring a more versatile skill set because of that diverse background in basketball or maybe even other sports?
Well, I think that footwork that they develop in basketball is, especially for a defensive lineman like Zion, is incredibly valuable when they transfer that to the football field. I also think they develop a certain amount of stamina that maybe just single sport athletes that, may just play football or may just play baseball don't, because there's nothing but running in basketball. So I definitely think those two things, are valuable assets when a guy like Zion, who is fairly new to football still, but those skills definitely translate, for him in football. And again, both these guys are kind of raw talent still, but I do think, those basketball skills that Zion particularly, gained. I watched Julius Peppers play high school basketball, and he was a pretty incredible player. And then I watched him line up at tailback on the football field, which made him look even more incredible. But yeah, I think that's kind of where it started really with Julius Peppers. 20 years ago when Julius was coming out of school, guys his size were just playing basketball. They weren't, a guy 6'6", he wanted to be a basketball player. He had no interest in football. And then Julius and Mario Williams and guys like that who were that size, now all of a sudden were showing an interest in becoming football players. Then they go into college and be successful and on to the pros. Now you got a bunch of kids of that size who are saying, hey, I'm a dime a dozen at 6'6" in basketball, but in football, I'm an elite type athlete. And I do think Julius and Mario Williams were kind of pioneers in terms of, at least in our state, causing kids of that size who were probably enamored with NC State basketball or Duke basketball or UNC basketball and wanted to play basketball for those colleges, now all of a sudden they started wanting to play football. And I think that's why North Carolina has really developed, and I'd have to go back and look, but if we have developed some great defensive line prospects, not just for our own schools, but, for schools out of the state, over the last 10 to 15 years. And again, I think that all started with Mario and Julius, kind of, giving a kickstart to that, big kids wanting to play football.
Yeah, kind of in that realm too, although not maybe quite as big. A guy I know you covered quite extensively in recruiting was Manny Lawson coming out of high school.
Manny's from my hometown.
Yeah. But what stood out obviously about Manny Lawson was the athleticism coming out of high. Obviously, he was a freak athlete.
Well, before I even knew about Manny as a football player, his AAU basketball coach actually called me and said, hey, man, I got a guy that's getting ready to start playing football over at Eastern Wayne High School. He's been a great basketball player for us at the AAU, but I'm telling you, he's going to be something special in football. And lo and behold, look what happened.
First round draft pick.
Yeah.
Made a few $1 million. I like one of the things I like about this NC State class is the athleticism. You mentioned Zion Reeves, good basketball player. Julian Gray can flat out fly. I know at the Rivals Combine, both Jacoby Baldwin and Jordan Poole tested really, really well. Jordan Poole in particular had great numbers athletically. Chase Hatley, the safety, is another kid that really intriguing. Kind of
very underrated kid in this class, I thought.
Yeah.
You know,
what about that athleticism, and maybe talk about Chase Hatley a little bit as well?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Chase. When I first started looking at him on film, the first thing that popped in my mind was Tanner Muse, who was a really good safety at Clemson. I think from South Point High School. You know, really has great length. You know, as a safety. You know, and again, a guy who's underrated in terms of his athleticism. I'm not sure why it took so long, you know, for people to get on him, but you know, Raleigh has become such a better recruiting ground than it was 10 years ago. Raleigh and Charlotte both have just exploded. You know, I remember, again, you know, some historical thoughts here, but when I first started covering recruiting, you know, Charlotte might have put out, you know, and I'm talking about when Chris Leak, you know, came out of Charlotte Independence and went to Florida, but there were only like 3 players out of Charlotte who signed with Division I FBS type programs that year. Now, you know, Charlotte and Raleigh are putting out 20 and 30 kids a year. And so it's really amazing what has happened in those 2 metropolitan areas. And Chase Hatley, again, is a guy who was kind of under the radar for a while until the very finish. And NC State was very fortunate, I think, to get him because, again, I look at him and see a really physical, athletic safety type guy, you know, in the mold of a Tanner Muse who had a pretty good career at Clemson.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, too, because you mentioned Crowwell. I'm not trying to repeatedly make you feel old, but did you cover his dad or his uncle and recruit him?
Yeah, the whole family, really. In fact, I actually was cleaning out as I was doing this renovation on my house here recently. I was cleaning out some files, and I found some of my old Super Prep magazines that I'd held on to, and I can't remember. I can't remember which. I think it was his uncle that I think I had rated maybe, you know, in the 20s. It's obviously ridiculous. It shows you how rankings are not very valid, I guess. The way I look at these rankings, too, before I go into that is, you know, I do this for kind of fun. I don't expect everybody to, because I rank somebody number 1 or somebody number 100, that's a be-in and all of what this kid's going to do. I just feel like it's a jumping off spot for fans to get an idea about, you know, players. You know, how I rank them or anybody else rank them, it doesn't really matter, you know, but I do think it's a really fun, you know, read, and it gives you more information about kid, and maybe it sets some unrealistic expectations sometimes. But again, that's part of the fun of following them. You know, you hear about him being a 4-star guy, and so you want to follow this guy. But it's just as fun to follow the 2 or 3-star guy who winds up, you know, being a great player. But back to the Crowwells, yeah, I pretty much covered all the family in recruiting, and you know, it's remarkable how that much talent can come out of one family. You know, here in Fayetteville, you know, we had the Pinckney family. Reggie Pinckney, the father, who played at East Carolina and played with the Detroit Lions. Then Patrick Pinckney, his son, led East Carolina to 2 straight Conference USA championships. And then Aaron Curry is also Reggie's son, who was a Butkus Award winner at Wake Forest and a first-round draft pick. So that's kind of our version here in Fayetteville, but it's nothing close to the Crowwells.
You're not too far from Richmond County. You mentioned you've seen Jaleel Davis, and I'm assuming you've seen Jacoby Baldwin and all those guys. They had 4 or 5 FBS prospects in this class. You know, what kind of stood out about those 2 guys when you saw them in person?
Well, like I said, Jaleel is, when you look at him, you read all these things like he's a 300-pound plus guy, but then when you look at him, you go, really? I mean, he looks like he's 260 or 270. He doesn't look like a 300-pound guy, which tells you he's got this incredible frame that he's going to continue to grow. He could be 320 plus and still, you know, really look like a, you know, not like overweight or anything. And that's what I liked about him at first, that I thought he had a frame to still grow, even though he's this massive human being. But, you know, Richmond is one of these teams that runs a pro-style offense. So he wasn't just pass blocking or he wasn't just run blocking all the time. He had to be good at both. And he was very good at both and is very good at both. And I think, again, playing in that type of offense is going to hasten, his ability to advance and transition quicker into the college level. I think he's a guy, and I don't normally say this about offensive linemen because to me that's the hardest position to predict a kid coming out of high school, his success at a college level. But I think Jaleel Davis is a guy that I can see these things that I believe will help him contribute pretty early in his career. I'm not saying next year, but it's a possibility. That's the kind of athlete and the kind of size and strength and football intelligence that I see him play with. And Jacoby is a guy that's not going to knock your socks off. He's not the fastest guy on the field. He's not the biggest guy on the field. But he is very acrobatic. He will make some incredible catches because he has great leaping ability, great timing. He runs routes like a college player already. And again, I go back to the program he's in at Richmond County. Brian Till has gone into that program, and for several years, Richmond really struggled after being one of the top programs in the state. And Brian was at Terry Sanford, so I know him very well. And he took that job knowing that if you don't contend for a state championship at Richmond as a coach, they're going to be ready to run you away. And he has done that. He's got that program turned around. And if it hadn't been for COVID, with these guys and a couple others, Caleb Hood, who was their quarterback, who's at UNC, and a couple other guys they would have been a contender for the 4A title this year without a doubt. And so it's kind of sad that we're not going to be able to see that. There's a lot of teams in that situation. Huff High School had 9 FBS, committed players last fall, and now a bunch of those guys are going on to pursue their college careers, so they won't be playing, this spring. Same thing down at Rocky Mount. Keyshawn Silver and a bunch of players on their team. Rocky Mount would have been a big contender for a state title. Now they're going on. And so I think that's one of the things we're going to miss this spring, not being able to see these guys play their senior year. But yeah, those two guys at Richmond were very impressive. And again, I think are going to be great contributors at NC State before long.
One guy that we mentioned, but I don't think we touched on in a lot of detail yet, is Jordan Poole. I know he's a big-time linebacker recruit that NC State was able to get. I know that's one that they really wanted to land. A lot of these guys, seems like they would have benefited from having a senior season of tape to maybe escalate themselves in the rankings where they maybe see fit. But of all these guys, maybe Jordan Poole kind of sticks out as one of those guys that really, it would have been nice to see some senior tape from him, and I think he would have been even more talked about had that been the case. But what's your impression of Poole, and what kind of linebacker is NC State getting in a guy like him?
Yeah, but I agree with you, Justin, about it would have benefited him. Jordan played a lot of running back in high school, and there's probably more tape of him running the football than playing defense. And so a senior year with more film of him playing defense probably would have helped him, but he still got where he needed to be at NC State. Jordan's just a physical, player. Whether he's playing offense or defense, the guy's trying to knock somebody down. And he's again, maybe was under the radar a little bit, but I think a guy who special teams very early on at NC State just because of how aggressive and physical he plays, and a pretty smart player too. For a guy who hasn't been on defense maybe as much as offense, I think he still has that football IQ that will help him transition pretty quickly, especially as a special teams player very early.
I thought your point about the rankings was pretty interesting. I wanted to just touch on that real quick. I mean, to me, I've always thought of them as kind of just a starting point for where these guys are when they get it. I mean, anybody that follows college football, college basketball, the preseason rankings are never the same rankings as they are at the end of the season. I mean, do you think the development, once these guys finally get to the college level, I mean, that's ultimately more of an important piece of the pie in the grand scheme of things, wouldn't you agree?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, if you don't develop them when they get there, you know, they're not going to be able to use just the skills they had in high school and become a great college player. They've got to have people that know how to develop them. And, I think Dave Dorn has done a fantastic job of that at NC State through the years. I mean, and again, that's why, even though you may have the number one class in the country, and maybe that's not a good comparison, because if you have the number one class, they're probably all 5-star recruits, and they're probably all going to be pretty good. But even if you're ranked, 25th, you can still have a great class that can improve your program if you develop players. And, and that's what I've always said. A lot of people, again, talk about Mac Brown and the class they've gotten. But if they don't take those players and all that talent they have and do a good job of developing, they could wind up being a 3 and 8 or 9 team, So it doesn't matter. The rankings go out the window once the kids show up on campus. That's something for us fans and writers to kind of talk about. And but I guarantee you, Dave Dorn, when it comes to recruiting people, he's not looking there sitting there saying, "Oh, this guy's a 5-star or 4-star. I got to get him because of that star." He's looking at guys that will fit into his program, into his system, and that are good citizens. I mean, everybody has to look at that these days too. I mean, in these day and time, if you're not looking at a guy's character, then you're setting yourself up, for problems. And I think that's what's going to be kind of interesting about this 2022 class, with the lack of time that coaches have been able to spend recruiting these kids, not being able to bring them on campus all last summer, for camps and visits, and right now still being limited as to how much they can bring kids on campus. The Rocky Mount coach even said to me, he said a lot of guys are going to be making mistakes on this 2022 class because of that lack of interaction they've had with them. They're not going to know these guys as well, and I think that's one of the bad things that's going to come about because of this COVID-19 pandemic when it in terms of recruiting.
A good example of what Justin was kind of talking about. It didn't apply to Dave Dorn, but it was the 2011 class of which Dave Dorn did coach some of. That Tom O'Brien signed, was ranked number 86th in the country by Rivals.com. 86th. If you think about it, how many Power 5 teams are there? So that means there were a boatload of mid-major programs that Rivals thought had better recruiting classes. And in that class, T.Y. McGill is still in the NFL. Justin Burris is playing for my Carolina Panthers, starting safety this year for my Carolina Panthers. Joe Tooney has started every single game he has played since he's been with the New England Patriots, and it's about to become a very rich man if he's not already very rich, because he got the franchise tag last year. Nick Sadie and Will Ballman were two of the best specialists NC State had before the current group came in. Rodman Noel was a great linebacker. Mike Rose, he was the other. Mike Rose was in that class. Friend of the
podcast.
Yeah, playing in the CFL right now. Hakeem Jones. I mean, if you go back and look at that class, that's not the number 86th class in the country.
Yeah, look what they did on the field at NC State and the success the program had when they were there too. And that's the bottom line.
The 2007 class was ranked number 50 in the country. J.R. Sweezy is still playing in the NFL. George Bryan turned out to be a pretty good tight end for NC State over the years. Marcus Kuhn played in the NFL. Artie Cole played in the NFL. And you might have heard of the quarterback they had in that class. He was some 2-star named Russell Wilson.
That's the most amazing story there.
Yeah. But I wanted to talk about the 2022 class and kind of the difficulties, not only evaluating them because they hadn't even played a junior year. You're crossing your fingers they're going to be able to play in the spring. You hadn't had them on campus. You hadn't had camps in over a year. And then you throw in the dynamic of the numbers game. because of the NCAA freezing eligibility. I know at NC State, this may be the smallest class unless something changes. They may have to take one of their smallest classes in many, many, many years. So what are some of the, if you were a college coach, you've been around them a lot, what are some of the challenges that you see them facing with this 2022 group?
Well, again, the first thing that you just mentioned, Matt, is because of the NCAA ruling, giving everybody an extra year, you got to figure out among your seniors, who actually might want to take advantage of that senior year, or who you would want to come back for that extra year. And it also affects all the classes below them. I mean, technically a guy that played as a freshman last year at NC State can still be considered a true freshman this year. So they can have 5 years of eligibility, and so, that it's going to be kind of a checker game for the coaches to kind of figure out the moves to make and who to keep, who wants to come back, who is eligible to come back, and then translate into that, how many people can you bring in a recruiting class? And, obviously, I don't think you're going to see many people in that 2022 class. Probably not going to sign 25, the maximum of 25. I would doubt most people do unless they're expecting a mass exodus. And, of course, because of the transfer portal, mass exodus is a possibility any day. And certainly NC State's been a team and a program that's seen, players go into the portal. But that's going to be interesting to see how coaches juggle the rosters and how that impacts how many people they can actually recruit. I mean, and again, that transfer portal has become, an extra thing in there that everybody has to consider, because if you recruit, 4 quarterbacks and one of them doesn't get to play immediately, then does he go to the transfer portal, or does he hang around? Does he stay for spring practice after you've almost done your recruiting and then decide to leave and leave you with, the Bailey Hockman situation is kind of, a case in point. Bailey leaving, I think, leaves NC State with only 2 scholarship quarterbacks in the program right now until McLaughlin, and I guess he's coming in already, right? So before he got there, Devin Leary and Ben Finley, right? The only 2 scholarship quarterbacks. So, not knowing if Bailey was going to hang around for another year, kind of put them in a situation where they might have recruited a second quarterback in the 2021 class had they been aware, that was a possibility. But now, he takes off after the season and they don't have that option really unless they can find somebody here at the last minute, maybe somebody from the transfer portal or a junior college quarterback maybe, but most of the high school quarterbacks you would want in your program have already been signed or committed somewhere. So, it's going to be really interesting to see how this works out, and it's going to have a big impact on the 2022 class. There'll be a lot more good players who may not be signing with FBS programs. So the FCS guys surely should be paying attention and really be on their toes, because there's going to be a lot of really good talent available to them out of this 22 class because of that.
Justin?
Well, Matt, unless you had any specific questions about specific 2022 guys, I was going to give Sammy one final big picture question before we wrap it up here. Matt, did you have anybody specific, or should I go ahead and give Sammy the big picture question?
Go ahead. I like big picture.
Okay, Sammy. Well, he's a good big picture guy. He's given very thoughtful analysis here, so thank you, Sammy, for joining us here this afternoon.
Sammy, how many times has somebody said you were thoughtful?
Not very often. No, I appreciate that. I enjoy talking football, man. Even though I'm retired now, I still stay close to it as I can. And again, hope to be writing some, and maybe you guys will see me down the road somewhere.
Well, there's a lot of good things to talk about after last season. I mean, you got NC State and Carolina both with successful seasons last year. NC State being more so of the surprise. I don't think anybody predicted that they were going to have the 8-4 2020 campaign like they did, and now you've got a lot of that talent coming back for another year. You've got 10 of your 11 defensive starters coming back, a good amount of them coming back on offense. So I guess my big picture big picture question for you, Sammy, is what are the expectations for NC State in 2021, considering the returning talent you've got coming back, considering the momentum within the program? I know they didn't get the result that they wanted in the Gator Bowl, but granted, 4 of your most important defensive starters were out in that game, in an already, pretty competitive matchup with an SEC opponent. 7 ACC wins, a program record. You got that talent coming back, and you've got this smart 2021 class coming in. So what do you expect from NC State in 2021? Do you think it's it's a return to normalcy with the divisions? Maybe it's another year that NC State can sneak up in the Atlantic Division.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's great potential there for this team. I do think you can't put a lot of emphasis or importance on bowl games these days. Used to, we would say that the bowl performance was kind of a jumping off point to the next year. But I think this day and age where, people are opting out of the bowl games, you really can't say that that's a team, that's your next year's team. So, but I look at the way they played down the stretch. I thought they developed, and you're talking about they developed really well without the guy that probably should have been their starting quarterback. So you have to give Bailey Hockman some credit for that. He kind of steadied the position and made it good enough for them to play well and to get to 7 and 8 wins. But that defense is what I'm going to be looking at next year. With all those guys returning, Peyton Wilson, obviously one of the best players in the ACC and beyond. Drake Thomas, I've really been in love with that guy since he was, at Wake Forest and in high school. That secondary, which, in the past couple of years has really taken its lumps with injuries and giving up big plays, now looks really good. Up front, all these young guys that they were playing on the defensive line are now a year older, a year stronger. So I think that potential on defense really makes this team, one to watch. Can they overcome Clemson? That's $1 million question. Clemson's pretty good. They're on a roll. They've got the talent. They've got the depth. They don't have Trevor Lawrence anymore. They don't have Travis Etienne anymore. Defensively, they were not as good this year as they have been in the past couple of years. So, so maybe that defense and Devin Leary getting back in there and being healthy on offense. Obviously, we got great running backs at NC State. You got a good offensive line that got a lot of experience with some of the young players. I look at this team as definitely an ACC contender. Again, playing in the Atlantic, though, that is obviously the toughest division, and everybody's looking up at Clemson. But NC State at times in the past has really played Clemson very well. So anything can happen on a given Saturday, and I think NC State would be positioned as good as anybody in the ACC to challenge Clemson next year.
What makes that upcoming NC State-Clemson game even more interesting is that it'll be the ACC opener for the Wolfpack. It'll be the first time the Tigers have to go on the road in the ACC. So an early season meeting between the two programs. And, you'd hope by that point, knock on wood, with COVID hopefully more so in our distance, that you'd have some fans in Carter Finley Stadium. So I know that'll be one that we're all looking forward to, and getting back to some more normalcy with these college football Saturdays, because I can tell you it just was not the same being out at Carter Finley Stadium for these games without fans. I mean, I know they let in 7% at the end, but it still looked like a high school game being played in a college football stadium at best without Wolfpack Nation filling out Carter Finley Stadium. What was that like for you before we close out here, Sammy? Because I mean that.
Well, yeah, it was strange. I mean, I covered games everywhere from Appalachian State to UNC, NC State to East Carolina. So I went from one end of the state to the other this past year, and being in those stadiums that are normally raucous. I mean, all those fan bases, particularly State, East Carolina, and Appalachian, are just create these great, environments, and to go in there and hear the coaches yelling on the sidelines at the players and even in the press box, which were half full, because they couldn't accommodate all the press because of that. It just made for a very eerie environment. Once the game started, it was okay, but it made for a very eerie environment everywhere I went this year, and so I'm really hopeful that this COVID thing can be get in check, and then next fall we'll be seeing full stadiums and get the fans back in there, because it really isn't the same without the fans, and that's what it's really all about anyway, isn't it?
Absolutely. Hear to that. Well, Sammy, thank you for the conversation today. That was very interesting. Got a lot of great info there for Wolfpack fans. So if you want to hear this conversation, or you want to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcast app, Google Play, and if you're watching us on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and give this video a like. You can follow us on social media. Give us a follow at The Wolfpacker. You can follow me personally at Justin H. Will. Give us a like on Facebook, NC State Wolfpack on thewolfpacker.com. And again, please remember to use that promo code PACK60 on thewolfpacker.com for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis at thewolfpacker.com. So for Sammy Batten, co-host Matt Carter, this is Justin Williams, and this has been the Wolfpacker Podcast.